Government and Education, presented by Erin O'Brien. Introduction. So, educational policies may be influenced by federal government, then carried out by state and local governments. This presentation aims to describe the roles of the three branches of government, federalism, and other major aspects of U.S. government polity which influence educational policies. Educational reform will not be evaluated, though we will have time to reflect about policy impact on education policy and how it's implemented. As an overview for where we're going today, we're going to take a look at the fundamentals of the U.S. government polity, excluding any discussion of the current executive policy. First, we will review the three branches of the U.S. government and understanding how they interact to ensure checks and balances. Next, we will review the federalism means in the U.S. government. What federalism means in the U.S. government, understand judicial review, limited government, and popular sovereignty. Then, sync these concepts to understand the separation of powers within the U.S. government polity. Finally, we'll have a brief discussion on the impact of government polity and educational policy implementation. First, the branches of U.S. government. By splitting the governing entities into three separate branches, the Constitution aims to reduce bias among the branches to fairly enact legislation. The three branches of federal government are the judicial, legislative, and executive. The judicial branch interprets the Constitution to inform lawmakers. The legislative branch proposes votes and can pass laws, and the executive branch enforces or vetoes laws passed by the legislative branch. Further, the legislative branch allocates fundings to implement policy. Checks and balances. The mission of checks and balances is to ensure horizontal and vertical equity. This is done by applying methods for implementing policy and balancing powers assigned to each branch. To incorporate them successfully, the paths to follow are threefold, maybe even fourfold. The first is democratically elect or appoint representatives by varying political philosophy to implement legal equity. This is done by varying duration of appointment per position and electing representatives by majority of votes. The second of the four parts is to split the federal government into three branches, which are financially independent. The branches are granted the means to block coercion, and this provides a method to override personal policy changes. The three branches explained before were the judicial, legislative, and executive. The third part of checks and balances is to apply sovereign powers to states and local governments to balance the federal government decisions. And the last part is to implement laws that can protect or override decisions made by any single branch in accordance with the Constitution. So as you can see here, we have three kind of variances of checks and balances where we have a federal government, the state government, and local government. And within each of these, there are different branches. And within each branch, they are elected officials or appointed officials. And we will discuss that a little bit more later. Okay, so knowledge check. What are the three branches of government? Correct. Judicial, legislative, and executive. What is the role of each branch? You got it. To interpret the laws, make the laws, and enforce the laws. And could you give an example of federal checks and balances? So one way to think about this is about rock, paper, scissors, or sometimes the executive branch, legislative branch, and judicial branch take on different roles for rock, paper, scissors. So I'm going to give you a couple of different examples and then explain how these branches can take on those different forms. So the first example is the president appoints a Supreme Court judge, but the Senate can approve or revoke the judge appointment. Another example would be that the president can veto a law, but Congress can overrule the veto. And the third example is the Supreme Court can declare laws or presidential decisions as unconstitutional. So in all of these examples, you can see that the executive branch would take on the form of rock, but the legislative branch and judicial branch could be either paper or scissors, depending on which part of the checks and balances we're describing. Okay, next, we're going to start the discussion of the other aspects of government and education, starting with federalism. Federalism is a vertical checks and balances as a political framework which incorporates state and local government to work democratically within the policy of the federal government in order to generate, abolish, and maintain laws for the greater good of the community. In effect, federalism is a policy described in the Federalist Papers 39 and 51, which would later be embedded into the U.S. Constitution. This way of political organization gave sovereign powers to each state, but united them into a nation in terms of commerce today. Today, federalism is still the political framework of the U.S. government, and it integrates, like I said, state and local governments to work democratically within the policy of the federal government. It may also be considered a vertical checks and balances. I think we said that at the very beginning. Okay. Next, judicial review. As described in our branches of government discussion, the judicial branch serves to interpret the Constitution in order to inform the legislator for making legal decisions. Further, in talking about checks and balances, we discussed that the executive branch can trump the legislative branch, the judicial branch can trump the executive branch, and the judicial branch informs the legislative branch. The role of informant is called judicial review. So in short, judicial review is a horizontal set of checks and balances of which the courts interpret the U.S. Constitution and the legislature democratically approves or vetoes the legal proposal. Now we're going to go on to the idea of a limited government. Limited government is a political philosophy that promotes partitioning of powers within a government polity to mitigate coercion. It does not mean that the government is limited to the decisions it can make. Instead, limited government applies limitations of authority which government branch or government system is legally allowed in accordance with its constitution. The U.S. government accomplishes this in a few ways. The first is enumerated authority by way of popular sovereignty, and the second is division of government in separate powers. So let's take a look at what those two are. So first, popular sovereignty. It is a political principle in which authority is given to an elected official by way of popular consent to implement legal policy on behalf of a community. So this means that we have an elected official, and that elected official takes on the popular vote. And the popular vote generally takes on the idea of what the community feels at that point in time. This can also be seen during different election seasons when we have a transition from different political parties. And when that happens, we can see where different policy comes into place. This aspect of limited government is an elected official, like we described, must uphold the law in accordance with the Constitution as well as on behalf of the governed people. So they are an extension of the voice of the people, and they do these within the boundaries of the position duties. Next, we're going to talk about separation of powers. So separation of powers is an aspect of limited government as well, and it is also a horizontal checks and balances within the U.S. government. This principle is enacted to divide the U.S. government into branches which work individually in accordance with the duties assigned in order to mitigate bias. As we described before, the three branches of government are judicial, legislative, and executive. All right, politics and education discussion. So this is a time where I want you guys to give a little bit of feedback and tell me about how you think education and politics work together. I have 3 discussion questions, and I'll call on somebody in the audience to answer one of each of the questions. So the first one is, how is executive policy carried out to local governments? One example that I thought of is that the federal government puts into effect a general law for executive policy and the state or local government work to implement the law in a way that is most beneficial for the state, especially for funding of new or revised policies. So I might want to consider allocation of funding at the state level for this one as well. How about the second question? As we've discussed today, how does government polity impact educational policy? One example I thought of is how politics influence education in the form of national, state, and local standards to implement laws for educators, students, and families. And that could be to think of advocating for student rights or advocating for educator rights. And the third one is, how do you suppose politics can influence education in the form of national, state, and local educational standards? One example I thought of is government polity and how it impacts educational policy. I was saying that government polity impacts educational policy implementation in terms of how policies are carried out from the executive policy to the local education. So at the executive branch level, at the federal level, I should say, we have an example of something that we have talked about before is Every Student Succeeds Act. So this was put into place in 2015 by President Obama, and this is a federal policy to enable educators, to enable states to allocate funding according to educational needs within each state. And so there are standards of this policy that are allocated to states, and those states have to meet those federal standards, but within each state and within each district, they can form their own policy and their own ways to carry out that federal act. So in conclusion, today we reviewed the fundamental polity of the U.S. government, including discussion of the three branches of government, checks and balances, federalism, judicial review, limited government, popular sovereignty, and separation of powers. To connect how government polity impacts educational policy implementation, we finished with a brief discussion on the impact of government polity and educational policy implementation. With that, I want to leave you with this idea. For you to use your voice to advocate for students' education as a member of the school board. You are the connection between government policy and education implementation. I also have a list of references that you can take a look at the end of this presentation. I can send it out to whoever wants a copy of this, or you can stay after and I can answer any questions you have. Thank you for attending.